Since the recording of this interview with Dr. Remi Piet on October 10, Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno backed down on the fuel subsidy cut, with the subsidies returned to force as of October 14 and street protests ended. In an email to INN, Dr. Piet said that the reversal either showed weakness or a capacity for dialogue, depending on where you stand on the topic. He said that while Moreno had reversed his decision, the government had committed to seeking a new plan to address the subsidies, which were estimated to cost the government $1.3 billion annually. Dr. Piet concluded that the government's first attempt to cut the subsidy was abrupt, and while the government was indeed backing down, it left an opportunity for it to develop a more progressive cut, but it all depended on whether Moreno could show he had a backbone. I'm Scott Tibbles with the Investing News Network. Today I'm having a chat with Remi Piet, who is Senior Director at America's Market Intelligence. Thank you for joining me, Remi.
My pleasure, Scott.
Today, we're going to have a look at Ecuador, a prolific mining jurisdiction with a lot of projects happening in the copper and gold sections. So, the country has a lot of significant players in the field. The country is host to the Cascabel copper project owned by SolGold and the Loma Larga gold mine operated by INV Metals, and that's just to name two of the big ones. It's also host to a number of projects operated by smaller Canadian companies. There's been a significant amount of unrest in Ecuador in the past few days, so much so that the government has been evacuated from the capital, Quito, over riots on the streets and the storming of parliament. The cause of the unrest is an end to government fuel subsidies announced last week by President Lenin Moreno, with fuel prices increasing dramatically in the aftermath of the government action. Moreno appears to be backed by the military, and the government is putting on a united front. So, Remi, we talk about Ecuador fairly often during our chats, mainly on community opposition to mining activity in the regions. I, of course, encourage listeners to find previous chats on the INN website published in June and August. So, from an outsider's point of view, this recent drama sort of seems to have come out of nowhere. What can you tell me about why Moreno has ended these seemingly very popular subsidies, and what sort of impact could this unrest have on the country's economy and mining industry?
Yes, obviously, we're going to be talking today about something fairly different that our usual talks in Ecuador that were more centered on local referendums and votes against different mining projects. And you mentioned SolGold, Cascabel's project, and Loma Larga in the Azuay province has two of those projects. You have to keep in mind that there's other very interesting and larger projects that in Ecuador, whether you're looking at Fruta del Norte, which is about to produce its first gold this year, or Mirador, which is probably the largest project in copper projects in Ecuador today, by the Chinese today. But they were developing, mining industry over the last few years, making Ecuador, the darling destination for new foreign investment, whether from Australia or from Canada mainly. But the situation has evolved today. And first of all, on the referendum side, there was a key decision at the end of last month that actually rejected a series of requests from popular approval to mining projects. So that fear for mining investors has somewhat decreased until there's a better organization from anti-mining organizations and a potential new requests. But what's now making headlines is a key decision from Moreno to completely overhaul the series of economic policies that have been in place in Ecuador for more than a decade. One has to keep in mind that Ecuador has been run by Rafael Correa between 2007 and 2017, a very, let's say, left-oriented regime, and with a series of criticism in terms of the democratic let's say structure of that regime and the way that Korea led. The position from Korea under his rule was a country that sided with Venezuela, sided with Nicaragua, on the divide between left and right in Latin America, that was much more closer to Chinese investment than to any kind of liberalization of the economy. And this the what has changed with the arrival of Lenin Moreno in power, considered by Korea as a betrayal, because Moreno was supposed to be his right hand and his in his the follow up of his own rule in Ecuador. Moreno has completely changed the way that the political system worked in Ecuador, being much more, let's say, open to dialogue, being much more creating bridges with a series of opposition movements, whether from the right wing or even indigenous communities until fairly recently, although that has backlashed fairly recently, and trying to just change really the way that politics happen in Ecuador by being much more inclusive. Also, the key change was a change in terms of foreign policy in Ecuador, moving away from the Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia triangle of Alba, and turning towards much more generation of foreign investment, and including the IMF to the table. And that's where the key changes happened. Ecuador is today in a very complicated fiscal position. It owes a lot of money to the Chinese, which has invested more than $50 billion over the last few years, with a series of reimbursement that are owed very quickly. And therefore, the only option for Moreno was to try to implement a series of reforms that are completely supported and actually created and generated by the IMF team, that has demanded for a series of, in exchange for a series of support to the Ecuadorian economies and loans, that Ecuador just changed all its fiscal policies of supporting, creating large subsidies in terms of oil consumption, but also decreasing demand. The IMF decrease also a series of decrease in terms of customs rise for imports inside the country. So you're seeing right now Ecuador moving away from mercantilist country that was on the side of globalization to one that tries to generate more international investment, that turns towards free trade, turns towards more support from the Western countries through the IMF, but in exchange has to change its entire economy by limited subsidies to the energy sectors, and to a series of most poor population, reducing its deficit by slashing a series of salaries in the public forces, and also decreasing a series of a barrier to trade. And that's these measures have been announced last month, and have immediately resulted in key demonstration, large demonstration in the streets. Obviously, cutting down subsidies has led to a doubling of price of gasoline in Quito and in all across Ecuador. The cutting down of salaries by 20% in some public sphere also has created a series of resentment, and that has generated a large series of demonstrations that gather not only a reaction to this economic decision, obviously that's the center of it, but also a series of discontentment towards a government that hasn't been able to bank on the commodity prices just yet, because production is not just arriving now, apart from a few projects, and also is suffering from a decrease of the oil prices over the last couple of years.
Okay, and so staying with the unrest side of it, we'll come to mining shortly. But does Moreno have popular support? I mean, there are obviously riots on the streets, but who are the protesters, and conversely, who is supporting him in these actions?
What's interesting with Moreno is that when he actually stepped into power, he actually enjoyed a very strong popularity for at least a year. I mean, uh, very large majority of Ecuadorian welcome the arrival of a new leader that right away tend to privilege dialogue with different actors. He sat down and he actually released a series of indigenous leaders. He sat down with different stakeholders from either the business sector, by having even inside out of his the government now, the energy minister is a former Ali Burton executive, something that would be completely impossible to imagine under Korea. And also talking with workers union, we're talking with indigenous communities. That has lasted more or less 1 year. Then the perception on Moreno was that sitting down with everyone and tending to having positive meetings, trying to make friends with everyone without taking key decisions, as turn the vision of Moreno as potentially a weak leader, someone that could not take strong decisions and decide to try to be friendly with very opposing sectors of the country. His political move away from the Korea inheritance, and Korea is trying to come back to the country, although it's facing a strong is facing investigation in his countries, a warrant for arrest in Ecuador. So he's now, obliged to stay in Belgium, where he resides today. But the fact that Moreno moved away from Korea, he also cut himself from the traditional Action Popular party. He still, Korea created his own party. Can't create these schisms inside Action Popular, and Moreno therefore did not enjoy a strong majority in Congress and had to cozy up to center right movements and center right parties that were traditionally opposed to Action Popular. So you also have a lack of legitimacy and strong institutional backing in Congress and in the key sectors of powers in the country. And even Moreno did not enjoy, some of his supporters that he actually tried to push during the local elections last earlier this year in March, at the province level and at the mayoral level, did not get elected. And that's why Moreno is a fairly isolated president today that doesn't enjoy the popularity that he used to enjoy at the beginning of his mandate. That is trying to make a huge overhaul of its economy, of the country, with a series of key stresses and sacrifices that have to be accepted by the poorer levels of population that enjoy the subsidies in terms of energy prices and other profits in terms of salaries, especially minimum salaries in the country. That has led to the situation of crisis today, and that will probably last for a long time.
So there's a lot of political anger on the streets. Could this have any impact on the resources industry right now?
Well, it will have an impact, especially in terms of the balance sheet right away. I mean, when you have the price of a gallon of oil that gets multiplied by more than a factor of two, obviously the cost for the mining industry will be important. There were a series of positive reforms in the package that was just publicized by the Moreno regime, such as, for example, the decrease in terms of customs rights for equipment and machinery. But in truth, the mining sector already had a specific exemption to those taxes, so that actually doesn't have a positive impact right away on the mining community. What is important in terms uh, of mining investment in the country is obviously, more than anything, the vision and the reputation of the country and the stability of the country itself. Ecuador is a country that has in a history of a series of moments of states of emergency. In 2016, with the rise of the Shuar indigenous communities against the Mirador project, Correa was forced to create to have a very strong response to the Shuar, and way too strong response to the Shuar community, worsening a lot of the social discourse and communication that you could have with indigenous communities. But the what's at stake here is the institutional strength of the country itself. At the moment, Moreno had to flee Quito to go to Guayaquil with his government. So Guayaquil is now the de facto capital, and where all the organizations and governmental institutions are operating today. And there's a state of emergency in Quito. So the situation is obviously not very reassuring for any kind of investors or any banking sector that would be looking at potential investment in the country and short-term return. Now, this is one side of the story. The second side, however, is that those reforms that Moreno is trying to pass were deeply needed in Ecuador, in the sense that it made, even if it's extremely hard for the lower and the poorest levels of population to have to face hikes in gas prices. The situation today in Ecuador was that the deficit was so staggering and the dependency to China was so important that if Ecuador wanted to be able to make the move towards being a country of destination for foreign investment, a country where the large institutional banks were actually considering invested, it had to also make that decision to welcome the IMF and follow the recommendation from Washington's organization on this case. When we regularly talk with mining investors and with the large mining teams of the main banks investing in the mining sector, because we advise them, and Ecuador was not today on their country of destination for potential support. When Fruta del Norte was looking for funding and financial support, each company that actually got invested into it, whether you're looking at funds such as Orion or other French banks specifically, they had to make the case that Ecuador was a safe destination in terms of its macroeconomics. What Moreno is trying to do today is by taking those bold steps towards a liberalization of the economy, is to have Ecuador be treated as equal in terms of being a country where large banks and investors will work as equal as Colombia or Chile, for example. And then in that case, the potential for mining investment in Ecuador in the long run is very interesting because of the geological capacity of the country, because of these bold moves in terms of the economy, of making the country much more liberal for foreign investment. It will eventually bear fruit, but obviously the road to that level will actually be rocky for the next few weeks, if not month, in terms of making sure that the stability and institutional capacity for Moreno to continue reforms will lead to some result and will not only face backlash from a series of actors in the mining sector. And we can actually go, in terms of details, in terms of the position from CONAIE, in terms of the security issues to a series of mining projects with arsonists attacking some of the mining projects in Ecuador. All these are very interesting issues to look at a micro level, and that's a conversation that we could be having.
Okay, and so you would say that the situation right now is one of short-term pain but long-term gain for the industry in the country.
Obviously, if Moreno is able, Lenin Moreno is able to move forward with those reforms without having to back down and without securing the institutional stability of the country, then obviously it will have been a good signal towards mining investors and towards creating more institutional capacity to support of interesting mining projects in the country. It was a needed move, very unpopular. But that's something that investors in the mining sector should see as a positive in the long run, despite the very negative news that you will have for the coming month.
And so you've just mentioned that it's quite unpopular. So we're now a few days into the situation. Are there any signs that Moreno might well undo the changes that he's made, or does it look like he's going to be sticking to it?
No, as of today, you don't have. I mean, the news have been released fairly recently. It is also something that is not a decision from Moreno, taking very quickly. It was the result of a long diagnosis from the IMF. So it is backed by international organizations. It's not. I don't see Moreno. Stepping down in terms of kind of taking some steps back in terms of his reform and the decision is taking that they are some very strong reforms. I mean, you're looking at doubling of price of energy. You're looking at a decrease of 20% of salaries. Maybe he will try to accommodate, and he's already taking the steps to try to make a series of accommodation for the poorest level of population. Some of those numbers are so high might be reduced, let's say, from 20% to 15, or maybe more progressive. But clearly, it is a well thought decision from the Moreno administration, and I do not see him stepping back and not moving, continuing with those decisions. And to be very honest, it's not like he has really a choice. If Ecuador definitely needs to have the support of the IMF and a lifeline in terms of loans and support to its economy, to be able to respect its international engagement of reimbursing, especially I think it's $5.6 billion that Ecuador owns very shortly to China. If he wants to have this lifeline from the IMF, he has to continue and implement those reforms.
So when could we expect this situation to be resolved? So are there any signs that things are dying down? I mean, obviously we're so early in the process, but what sort of timeline are we looking at for perhaps Moreno returning to Quito?
So the Moreno's decision to move to Guayaquil with the entire government was more the result of a desire to be able to maintain regular, governmental actions and institutional stability in the country. When you're asking about the future of Ecuador, whether we're going to see some positive news, I think this is going to be taking several weeks, if not months. Here you have a conglomeration of opposition movements to the Moreno administration, fostered obviously by those economic decisions, but at the same time also fostered by key demands or movement opposition. Whether you're looking at Rafael Correa trying to come back to the country, demanding for you know new elections in the country before 2021, or you're looking at indigenous movements that are also now opposed to the Moreno administration because it has been opposing specifically mining development in the country. Now, clearly, if Korea and the indigenous communities were able to have a united front against Moreno, then there will be severe danger for Moreno. That will not be the case. I mean, Korea is seen as the clear evil to the eyes of the indigenous communities. Korea will never get any support from Konaye or Equalunari in terms of after 10 years of strong crackdown on the indigenous communities in Ecuador. And so you have clearly a split opposition today to the Moreno government. The demands from Korea to have elections in the coming month instead of the 2021 calendar is unlikely also to have any kind of follow through, because Moreno, by his decision to move to Guayaquil, has secured the capacity for the government to continue operating as if those events were not impacting too much the life of the country itself. Now, it is clearly a question of whether or not the Moreno administration will be able to sit down and create, some kind of dialogue with, especially Konaye, and with some key stakeholders in the country, creating, being, at the forefront of this demonstration. And that might have to go through a series of progressive implementation of the measures, or alleviating measures to try to make things and life simpler, especially for taxi drivers, the companies, the lorry companies, and the logistics companies and workers and the truck drivers in the countries that are the most impacted by this measure. So we will likely see, after those very strong announcement by the Moreno administration, some kind of attempts at reducing the impact for the most impacted communities, and that will hopefully allow the Moreno government to implement a large majority of the measures that were announced, and to have the country move away from institutional failure in case those demonstrations were intensified.
Okay, and so wrapping up, let's just go along with this. So these changes are taking place to allow Ecuador to pay back its Chinese debts. Does this mean that Ecuador is moving away from China? And I guess, what does China think of this?
Well, it does mean indeed that the Ecuador is moving away from China, and that has been something that has been constant throughout the Moreno administration since its election in 2017. I mean, the Korea administration was really dependent on Chinese investment and loans. That's how Korea was able, together with the high prices of oil, was able to maintain a certain the economy of Ecuador, and also create some sound infrastructure in the country in comparison with other neighboring countries. The decision from Moreno from the very first day when he stepped into the office was really to try to have the country move away from China and open towards more liberalization of the economy. We remember some clear speeches at the Davos conference over the last 2 years, when the things worsened in Venezuela. Moreno was one of the first one to actually provide support to Guaido, for example. So clearly, you have a country in terms of Ecuador that has issued the necessary signal to the international community to show that there's a strong desire to move away from leftist movement in Latin America, and lifeline given by Chinese loans rather than foreign investment from the Western world. So that's something that is not new in Ecuador, and Moreno is really sticking to his guns, sticking to his policies of showing a constant effort towards liberalizing the economy and moving towards having Ecuador as an attractive destination for foreign investment from Western powers, and not only loans from China. Now, the reaction from China, that doesn't mean that China is out of the equation at all. It means that Ecuador has been developing a new, let's say, a framework for cooperation with China, not based on loans, not based on financing some white elephants in terms of infrastructure. There are some two or three key examples in Quito of buildings that were built by Chinese investment that will unfortunately take several decades for Ecuador to repay, and that were probably not needed for the immediate future of the country. But it's more in terms of trying to encourage investment project by projects, whether in the energy sector or in the mining sector. You see some Chinese companies still knocking on the door of Ecuador to invest in the mining sector, and probably the objective here from Ecuador is to try to prevent what happened with Mirador, which is a Chinese investment that unfortunately did not understand how to operate in Latin America, how to work with local communities, how to create value creation at the local level to get some support from the neighboring communities to the project. And that's where the key issue is for Ecuador and for all Latin American jurisdictions from the mining sector. It is to be able to understand the environment in which the mine operates and create some clear bridges of collaboration with local mayors, with local communities. And that's what, unfortunately, the Chinese have not been able to do through Mirador and Cocoriente, in creating a bad reputation of mining in Ecuador that now is seeing its negative impact by the series of opposition through local consultation demands or protestation from the community. So here you're seeing that this move away from China actually is something that is very much in the long term and changing the way that operations are being carried in the country towards a much more modern way of operating in the mining sector and throughout the economy in Ecuador, towards more sound investment from well-established actors that will understand how to operate mining projects in the country and run the economy as a whole.
Fantastic. Well, then we will leave it there, Remy. Thank you so much for taking the time to give such an in depth look at the situation on the ground in Ecuador today. And that was Remi Piet, Senior Director at America's Market Intelligence. I'm Scott Tibbles with the Investing News Network. You can find us at investingnews.com and feel free to follow us at Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thanks for listening.